Okay, so we are going to be thinking about light and shadow in a very controlled way, and we're going to be thinking about light and shadow in a way that most of us don't typically think about light and shadow anymore. So I'll explain what I mean. I'm going to be asking you to set up a situation that you're going to be making a drawing from, where you are illuminating an object with a single light source. Okay, so what I need you to do is use your box. Oh, let me see. Okay, so we're going to be studying light and shadow by drawing our cone and an egg. Okay, so you're going to want, now, as you can see, because of the way I've positioned the box, the cone and the egg are in shadow, right? And that's the idea. We're not going to keep them in shadow, but the idea is that most people work in a room where you have light coming from all different directions. And that will not allow you to study light and shadow with the kind of clarity that I'd like you to study it. So the box is serving to create a situation where all of the light in the room in which you are working is blocked, okay? And then what you're going to do is you're going to take your light, whichever light you have. So here's a clip-on light. This is ideal for this kind of thing. And you're going to direct your light onto the objects in the box, so that you have only, and because of this camera, I don't know how to adjust this. That's all getting it's all getting blown out, but I'll show you more clearly the kind of light and shadow you want to be working with. So you're going to have a situation where you can set up a still life and then have it illuminated by only one single light source. And it's good, and you're going to be able to see a clarity of light and shadow. Maybe that's a better sense of what you're going to be looking at. So now you'll notice when I pull the light back a little bit further, you'll notice that you can see a clear light mass and a dark mass on those objects. So you're going to need to, again, for this assignment, you're going to need to get a box, and you're going to need to set up a light so that you have a clear sense of light and shadow on the object you're working from. Okay, so now I'm going to ask everybody to be working from an egg, because an egg provides a situation where you can get a really nice sense of light and shadow. And I'll show you a little bit more clearly. So I want to show you one trick about working with an egg. If you're working with an egg, you might be in a situation where you have trouble getting the egg to stay put. Now, it just so happens that you'll notice here, the egg doesn't want to stay there, right? It wants to roll. Here's a very easy solution with something everybody has. Take some salt, put a little bit of salt on the surface you're working on, and put the egg on top of that. And the salt creates a little bed that prevents the egg from rolling. Okay. So this is the kind of situation you want to set up to be working from. You want to set up your cone and you want to set up your egg, you know, in kind of some simple relationship to each other. And you want to have you want to have those objects illuminated in such a way that there's a clear sense of light coming from one direction only. Okay. Now I'll explain that a little bit further in our slide lecture and in the demonstration I do. So does anybody have any questions about that?
Professor?
Yes.
So as long as the box is big enough for the egg and the cone, right? Or you'll about that later.
Can you say that again?
No, I said as long as the box like can fit the cone and the egg together, it should be okay, right?
Yeah. We are going to need. We're also going to be doing a drapery study where we do something similar. So you should try to get a box a little, you know. You should try
on
to
the
get
taller
a
side.
To the sizes that I've shown. You should try your best.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, really, they should be easy to obtain. Again, you should be able to just like go into a liquor store or a corner store, you know, or just buy one at a Staples. They're not. They get expensive if you have to buy 100 to move, but if you're just buying one, they're relatively cheap. So, okay. What we've learned so far about the successful illusion of three-dimensional volumes and space on a flat surface. So I'm starting with this image. It's kind of a randomly, I found this image sort of randomly. I was looking for an interior office space, so I found it on a Google image search. And I'm showing this because I want to show the way we usually experience light, right? We don't think much about light at this point in history. We take light for granted. We are surrounded by light, right? So at all times of the day, we have some source of light that is illuminating the environment we are existing in, even in the middle of the night. I mean, I was actually walking through my apartment last night. I had to get up in the middle of the night, and there were multiple sources of light, even though all of the main sources of light were turned off. So there was light emanating from routers. There was light emanating from a printer in one room. There was light coming in through the windows from street lamps. So there was actually, in spite of the fact that it was the middle of the night and all of the main lights were off, there were multiple sources of light around. when we exist in our normal day-to-day activities, if you walk into a Queens College office, or typically when you walk into a Queens College art studio, someone flicks on all of those horrible fluorescent lights and we're suddenly flooded with light. We're flooded with light the same way these people are flooded with light. So they have light coming in through these windows. They have all of these light fixtures on the ceiling. So light's coming from our right through these windows. It's coming from above. There's a light here in the corner. There's light coming out of these computer screens. There's probably other light sources that we can't see outside of the frame of this picture. There's light everywhere. And that's usually the way we experience the world. But that's a very recent reality. Right? For most of history, human beings experienced, on the one hand, extremes of light and shadow. So during the day, they had light, right? And so all activities happened during the day. They happened between sunup and sundown, and or virtually all. There was some activities by candlelight, but even there, for most of history, candles were very expensive and only the wealthy could afford them. So there weren't candles to illuminate at night. So people experienced extremes of light and shadow. So light during the day, absolute darkness at night. And then when you did have light, it was virtually always from a single light source. So either outside, or you would, if you were lucky enough to be able to afford a home with windows, you virtually always had one window, maybe two windows on the same side of the room. So like in this famous painting by Vermeer, where light was a prominent concern for him, he's painting a figure that's illuminated by a single light source. And we're going to be studying light and shadow and how light and shadow helps us understand and draw form or volume, the sense of three-dimensional volume in a space, by studying light as a single source. And once you understand light as a single source and what light does to an object when it's shining on the object from a single light source, then you can really start to understand light even in much more complicated situations, for example, like in that office we looked at. So if we look at drawing and painting virtually from throughout history, with very, very rare exceptions up until 1900, and then some exceptions after that, artists are always illuminating their subject with a single light source. So this is a drawing by a French artist named Pierre-Paul Prud'homme. And he did drawings like this his whole life, which was actually unusual at the time. This looks more like a student-like drawing this drawing is probably done in about 1800. He did these, again, his whole life, probably a little bit later than 1800. So has a model posing for him, and he's doing a rather laborious drawing of that model, and he's illuminating the model with a single light source. And what's happening on this model, or how the light is falling across the form on this model, is exactly the way light falls on all forms. So the same thing happens no matter, when you're using a single light source to illuminate an object, the light falls across the form in exactly the same way. Now, depending on where the light is positioned in relationship to the subject, there may be more light, there may be more shadow, and so on. But nevertheless, the progression of tones across that volume are always the same. So let's start looking and understanding how light travels across a form, and what that reveals to us in our effort to create drawings that truly create the illusion of a believable three-dimensional volume on a flat surface. So what happens, I'm going to go beyond that. What happens as light travels across the form? So we see a number of what I call elements of light and shadow, and we always see these same elements. So what are those elements? First of all, for our understanding, we always want to conceive of an object that's being illuminated by a single light source. The first thing we want to notice is the large mass of light and the large mass of shadow. And we refer to that as the light mass and the shadow mass. So this is a image from a 19th century drawing manual, and it's showing 2 stages in the process of creating a fully rendered drawing, a drawing that would eventually look like this. So what the artist has done is used the same kind of structural lines to block in this fragment of a Roman sculpture. And then the artist has identified the large light mass and the large shadow mass. So identified light and shadow in terms of its simplest, most reduced, large masses, just the light mass and the shadow mass. So this large irregular light mass and then this large irregular shadow mass.
Professor, is that kind of like vector, like if you reduced an image down to just like its vectors, white and black, would that be considered the light mass and the shadow mass?
Yeah, I think that's right. Although I don't know, I'm not as familiar with that kind of technical imagery as maybe you are. Is that in digital rendering?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yes, that's exactly right. It's reducing it down to that light mass and dark mass. So we're all subtleties, where all gradations are eliminated. And so here we have the light mass. So on this figure, we have this long irregular light mass, and then we have this long irregular dark mass. So what can we identify within the light mass and within the dark mass that gives us that fullness, that sense of a fullness of value, right? And through that fullness of value, a fullness of visual information. So what we see in the light mass and the shadow mass, the first thing I want to point out is something called the core of the shadow. So you'll notice right along the shadow edge, so this is the shadow edge where the light turns into the shadow. That's sometimes called the terminator. And so these are terms that I'm not going to test you on, but you should start to try to remember these terms, because these are terms that we're going to be using to analyze drawings in the class, both the drawings you do and drawings we look at. So we have the light mass and the dark mass, and then we have the shadow edge or the terminator. And the term or the word terminator comes from the word scientists use to describe the point on the moon where there's the division between the light and the shadow on the moon. That's called the terminator. And so artists in the past 20 or 30 years, artists have adopted that term. So shadow edge to me seems more descriptive, but you more and more hear the word terminator. But so here's the shadow edge, right? And then right along the shadow edge, there's what's called the core of the shadow. So it's a darker band of shadow that happens right next to the shadow edge. So we have a figure standing in a space, and then that figure is illuminated by a light source that's coming from the right? And I think that's clear to all of us, right? So there's either an open window. It's possible there was some kind of rudimentary artificial light source that these artists used at this time. They actually did create, through a kind of elaborate setup of candles, light sources that they could use at night. Can anyone guess why we can, on this shadow mass, why we see this area of this dark band of shadow here? Anyone guess why that's happening, or just looking at the situation in this drawing? Can anyone come to any conclusion about why we see this darker band of shadow?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. I believe it's because the human body has certain contours that may seem invisible, but they're actually there, and that subtle little black line over there indicates the shadow it causes from the light source.
You've hit on something. I mean, that is tracing a line that, like, from a certain position, we would see that as the profile of the figure. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, like you kind of get an idea of like how the human body is kind of shaped in this instance, because I can see some lumps here and there, and I'm assuming that those are causing the shadows.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're getting at something. I mean, that's a good observation. So you're noticing the way the shadow line sort of crawls around the multiple volumes of the human body. I think that's
Yeah.
what you're getting at, right? Yeah, that's a good observation, because it shows us the complexity of the form. But let me just, let's look at something a little bit more simple. And let me just back up a little, because I'm not sure I was explaining that as clearly as I could have. This is a drawing of a simple sphere. So we're going to be doing a drawing of a simple egg. And this is a drawing of a simple sphere. So the light is coming. What's the direction that the light is coming from here?
The left.
The left, from the upper left. And so we have a very similar situation. We have a simple sphere. And then as that sphere rolls around in space, at a certain point, that sphere is the planes of the sphere are no longer facing the light source. And so as that sphere rolls away from the light source, it goes into shadow. And so here's what we refer to as the shadow edge, or again, this is sometimes referred to as the terminator. So that's where the planes on this sphere are no longer facing the light source. I say planes, in this instance, I mean curved planes. So here, to go back to, again, two more terms we use, here we have the light mass. That's the light mass on the sphere. Here we have the shadow mass, that crescent-shaped shadow mass. We can also call that the dark mass. Now, we have the light mass and the shadow mass. In the shadow mass, we see two main divisions. So we, again, on this sphere, just like in the figure, we see this area of darker shadow, and then we see this area of lighter shadow. So maybe a better way for me to ask the question I asked a minute ago with the figure was, why does the shadow get lighter down here? Can anyone figure that out? If the light's coming from the upper left, in theory, this part of the sphere, as that part of the sphere rolls underneath, it's no longer facing the light. So why do we see anything in there at all? Because we only see things if they're illuminated. It's the only way we see objects. If there's no illumination, we don't see.
It's because of the reflected light off the ground bouncing back up.
Exactly right. So it's because of what's called reflected light. And that's exactly what this is called. This is called the reflected light. So what's happening is light is traveling in straight lines, because light travels in straight lines from the light source. And those straight rays of light are hitting this curved plane of the sphere. But at this point, again, at this terminator, the light's no longer hitting that sphere. So the sphere rolls under and it's no longer getting direct light. But light is bouncing off of all different surfaces. So light is bouncing off the tabletop here, and then it's reflecting back into the shadow mass. It's reflecting off surfaces back here and reflecting back into the shadow mass. Light's coming down here, hitting here, reflecting back into the shadow mass. So there are virtually never situations in the world where an object turns into shadow and we lose the ability to see anything in that shadow, because there's light bouncing off of different sources and then reflecting back into the shadow mass. So this is the main light source, and then this is the shadow area. But then light is bouncing back into the dark mass so that we see reflected light. Reflected light is really important because reflected light helps us read an object as truly turning around in space, right? If we couldn't see anything in this dark mass, then that crescent shape would just read as a flat shape, okay? So we have the light, the shadow, reflected light, and then this dark band here, called the core of the shadow, is the point on the form that is neither facing the direct light rays, nor is it facing any reflective surfaces. So in a sense, it's a third plane. We have the planes on the object that are directly facing the light, the planes that are facing the reflecting surface, and then there's that third plane that's neither facing the light source nor the reflecting surfaces. So we get that band called the core of the shadow. So if we go back to the more complicated figure, we have the light mass, the shadow mass, and then we have all of these reflected lights. Like, why is the left cheek of this figure's hips illuminated? Why is this lighter than this? Neither of those surfaces are facing the light source. It's because light's bouncing off this surface here and then back in to the planes in the shadow that are facing these reflective surfaces. So Proudhon was an artist who liked to really exploit and even emphasize a little bit reflected lights. You want to be careful of doing that, because if your reflected lights get anywhere near as light as your light mass, then you start to lose the sense of form. Okay, so let's go back to our simple shape. So here we have a fully rendered sphere. If we look at this stage in the process of drawing this sphere, we have the block-in of the drawing, and then we have the artist tracing out the shadow mass, that crescent-shaped shadow mass. They've traced out this shadow. So what is creating this shadow shape here? Why do we see that?
The angle of the light hitting the sphere.
The angle of the light hitting the sphere, right? That's what's causing it. And what is that? And what is the situation that's happening? So the light's hitting the sphere and doing what?
It's causing like the one immediate shadow, which is the darker, and then the lighter is like the distortion of the sphere from that angle.
Well, what's happening? So this is called, what do we call this kind of shadow? Like when we're walking down the sidewalk and we see our shadow, what do we call that? We call it the shadow.
Cast shadow.
What did you say, Sebastian?
Wasn't it cast shadow?
Cast shadow, right. So this is the cast shadow. And the cast shadow is created by an object blocking light from hitting another surface. So the artist has blocked out the light mass, the shadow mass, and they've blocked out the cast shadow. And then the artist has blocked in, sorry for the poor quality of this image, they've masked in the shadow mass and the cast shadow mass, right? So the form shadow, this by the way, we can call the form shadow, and this is the cast shadow. So this is the shadow that's on the form itself, on the volume itself. So the artist has blocked in the light mass, the dark mass, or the form shadow, and the cast shadow. So in this block-in, the division between the light and the dark is very stark, right? All we see is that very simple light mass, dark mass. So why, when we actually see an object illuminated by a single light source, why is there this kind of softness in the transition? Like, we take that for granted, but why do we see what we can call a half tone or a middle tone? Why do we see light, shadow, and then why do we see this middle tone? What's creating that situation?
Isn't that because light is diffused?
It's diffused, yeah. And what? Well, I'm not. You know what? I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm not sure about the technical meaning of the term diffused. Maybe you might be right. Can anyone put it a different way? Like this plane of the object is directly facing the light source, right? This plane is perpendicular to the light source. So the light source is coming down at an angle, something like this. And then if we create a right angle plane in relationship to that light source, this part of the object is perpendicular to the direction of the light, or it's at a right angle plane to the light source. The light continues to travel, right, and starts hitting planes that are not at an exact right angle. And so it's not hitting those planes fully, right? It's not fully, these planes are not fully parallel to the light source. So we start to lose the ability to see those planes with the same kind of clarity that we can see the planes that are facing the light source, right? Our eye is able to see objects with most clarity and most detail when they are fully illuminated. But as they are less and less illuminated, we lose the ability to see their value and their color, for that matter. But that's another issue. So these are planes on the object that aren't completely turned away from the light source, but they're at an oblique angle to the light source. So less light is hitting these planes. So at the point where the object turns completely away from the light source, we don't get an abrupt shift into light. We get a slow transition. Depending on the kind of light source, sometimes the transition is softer, sometimes it's sharper. Here's a relatively soft light source, so we're getting a soft transition. So what we're seeing is seeing a sequence of planes, some of which are more directly facing the light source, some of which are turned away from the light source, some of which are turned more away from the light source, and then planes that are turned completely away from the light source. And once we start to understand those basic principles of light and shadow, we can really start to understand what's happening to either simple forms or complex forms when we're seeing them illuminated in situations where they are illuminated. So we've talked about those elements of light and shadow, right? Light mass, dark mass, cast shadow. What is this called again? This lighter area of the shadow?
You said form shadow? Is that what you said?
Well, this whole area is the form shadow. What's the lighter area called?
Reflective shadow.
Yeah, I mean, usually it's called reflected light. And does anyone remember what I called this band of darker shadow?
It was Terminator, right?
Or shadow?
Who was the person who said the second term?
Me, Sephi.
Sephi. The core shadow, right. The core shadow or core of the shadow. The terminator is that edge where the shadow turns from light to dark. That's the edge right here. That's the terminator. The core shadow would be in this drawing to the right and below the terminator. Does that make sense, Sebastian? So we have light mass, dark mass or form shadow, cast shadow, reflected light, core of the shadow or shadow core. What do we call this very lightest area here on the sphere? It's a common term
With the highlight.
called the highlight, right? Or the technical term for that is sorry, I'm slipping my mind. What is the technical term for that? Specular reflection. You'll probably never come across that term unless you're speaking to a real light and shadow nerd. I know a few of them. No offense to the light and shadow nerds. But usually that's just called the highlight. But the technical term is the specular reflection. And so again, light mass, highlight, dark mass, reflected light, core of the shadow, cast shadow. Now we have two further terms. These transitional values that turn the shadow into the light are called halftones or midtones. Okay? And then the very darkest part of any kind of setup, the point where there's absolutely no reflected light, absolutely no direct light, we call these either the shadow accents or I'm forgetting these technical terms now. Embarrassing. What do we call this? The shadow accent. That's what I've always called it. But in the past 20 years or so, these technical terms have come up. I'll remember it in a moment. So I'm going to be using these terms over and over again. Try to start remembering these terms so that we have a common language. Shadow accent. Hold on. I think actually I'm going to be showing a video in a minute, and I think he uses that term. Okay. Okay, light mass, highlight, halftone or midtone, dark mass, core of the shadow, reflected light, shadow accent. So we are going to be looking for all of those elements in the objects we are drawing. So we're going to be studying the rendering of light and shadow in a way where we set up a situation, we illuminate it with a single light source, and then we go about rendering that object by looking for those elements of light and shadow, those elements of light and shadow that are always going to be present. Now, it can sometimes be more difficult than I might be indicating here to see those elements of light and shadow because situations that you might be looking at are not always as clear as these situations here. But in order to make a successfully rendered, believable illusion of a three-dimensional volume on a flat surface, you want to look for and make use of these elements of light and shadow. Because these elements of light and shadow are the things that are going to be doing the work for you to create that successful illusion of volume. That sense that this is a round form turning around in space. We're going to be taking our study of simple objects in light and shadow, and then looking at how we can take that understanding and apply it to more and more complex forms. So for example, something that Proudhon is doing here, he's rendering a complex form, right? The hips of a human figure. So a human figure is a very complex volume in the sense that it's made up of a multiplicity of complicated anatomical organic elements. This is a simple volume. It has a simple, clearly understandable shape. But notice how Proudhon has understood the complexity of this volume as, on the one hand, a simple shape, right? A simple volume with a light plane, a light mass, shadow mass, just like this, a core of the shadow on that shadow mass, just like this, a reflected light, just like this, highlight, just like here, halftones, as that volume rolls around into space. There's the halftones here. These are also halftones where there are subtle variations on the large planes of the form. So you see that in more and more complex forms, and particularly in organic forms. So Proudhon has successfully depicted a very complex form in a way where there's an overwhelmingly convincing sense of the volume, the three-dimensional volume of this figure. He's successfully rendered that form by understanding the complexity, by conceiving of it with this same kind of simplicity. And that's the approach we're going to be taking. So before I move on to a video that does really reiterate some of the things I've said, but I think it's important to repeat some of these things. And this video, which you can find on YouTube, explains light and shadow with a kind of clarity that I think will enhance what I've been saying. So I always like to show this video. And I want to quickly show a selection of old master and contemporary drawings to just illustrate that artists always, when trying to create a representation of a believable volume, they virtually always use a single light source. So we see it here. So where's the light coming from in this drawing? So look at the head. It gets a little bit confusing if you just look at the torso, but if you look at the head, if you look at this arm, where's the light coming from?
Coming from the left, right?
It's coming from the upper left, that's right. Sorry, I'll be, give me 1 second. So, okay, what about in this drawing? Someone other than Sebastian. Natalie, where's the light coming from in this drawing? Natalie? Jalen, where's the light coming from this drawing?
Sorry, the top. Right, the top right.
Top right, yeah.
Yeah.
Top right. Kananar, where's the light coming from in this drawing?
The top left.
Kananar,
Yes, can you hear me?
where is the light coming from in this drawing?
The left,
Left and what else?
above.
Above, right. So, and this, hopefully people are seeing this so we can tell from the highlights, the shadow mass, right? What about this drawing? Anne-Marie, where's the light coming from in this drawing?
I would say the top left.
Top left, right. So, by the way, Michelangelo, Peter Paul Rubens, Charles White. So we're getting now into the 20th century. This is a Max Beckmann, who was a 20th century expressionist painter. Where's the light coming from here? Jesus, where's the light coming from here?
Under.
It's not under. This is a little bit harder to tell.
Is it like everywhere around?
No, it's not everywhere around. So sometimes you'll see this in 20th century artists. So they're not as obsessed with getting a very clear sense of the light. But if you study this, you can still tell that the light's coming from a single direction.
Is it top right?
top right. And why do you say top right?
Because if you look at, so it's the darkest part is on the, I guess, his right side of his face. But it's not towards the right of the chin, because his chin is fully illuminated, which means it's hitting that like weird part of the chin. And then you also have a little bit of shadow underneath his eyes, which shows that there's a little bit of light coming from above.
Yes.
And then also in his right side cheek, the cheekbone, the underneath is there's a shadow on that.
Yeah, that's right. So the light's coming from the upper right? So his you said a little bit of shadow, but actually his eye sockets are in deep shadow, right? And then everything from this point on the head, and notice the cast shadow created by the nose, everything here goes into shadow. So Beckman was very interested in, the vitality and a kind of energy created by the marks. So he's less interested in creating a very clear sense of the unity of these light and shadow masses. Nevertheless, he's still working with a single light source. This is Katie Kollwitz. So a little hard to see this head because it's at an angle. Here, this figure, where's the light coming from here? What do you think, Andrew?
I think that the light is coming from the middle left.
Yeah, it's coming from the left. Yeah. Yeah, and you may be right. It may, in this case, it may be coming a little bit lower than most of the drawings we've been looking at. So
except for the head, which I think the light's coming from the top for.
Well, on the head, I'd have to flip this drawing. The head, it's coming from here and hitting this plane of the head. And then it goes into shadow. That's reflected light. But it's a little hard to look at that because it's rotated. Let's just look at the figure. So the figure, Katie Kollwitz says, like we would call this, roughing in those elements of light and shadow. But because she's roughed it in and hasn't like really polished it, we can see with clarity those elements, right? The light mass, shadow mass, highlight, core of the shadow, reflected light, cast shadow. We get the beginnings of the block in of the halftone. So we see those elements of light and shadow very clearly. This is a contemporary drawing by Licia Scavage. So again, light coming from the upper right. The figure goes into shadow here. And a place where you see very traditional use of light and shadow is CGI in the past like 20 or 30 years. So if you look at any of the famous CGI movies, they always use a very traditional light and shadow situation. And they're using that so that the imagery they can create can read to the viewers as fully believable three-dimensional volumes. And I don't know much about CGI, and I personally hate these movies, maybe because I used to have to watch them when my kids were young over and over again. But I think that the people who made these CGI movies wanted to very clearly distinguish their movies from the kind of flat graphic tradition of animated films that had dominated for, since the beginning of animation. So they are creating these films that have a very fully developed sense of believable volume. And actually, CGI and other forms of digital imagery, contemporary games, when I watch my son play video games, they also do this. They're very conscious of illuminating the figures and the spaces with a very traditionally conceived light source that they're really taking from the light and shadow that was developed during the Renaissance. So here, for example, the light coming from the upper right, All of the planes on the form that are turned away from the light go into shadow. Notice the cast shadow here from Shrek's nose, very similar to the cast shadow here on the Beckman. They're very conscious of core of the shadow, reflected light, cast shadow, shadow accent, highlight. That's very highly developed and developed with great precision because they have computer programs that can apply that light and dark situation to all of these volumes.
Professor,
Yes.
I'm sorry. It looks to me like it's coming from the upper left, the light.
I'm sorry. Did I say upper right, upper left?
Yeah.
I mentioned that I've always used the term shadow edge. I've always said instead of terminator, I've always used the term highlight instead of specular reflection. I've always used the term shadow accent instead of that other term that is escaping me right now. I'm ashamed to admit. That's because I learned all of this stuff in the early 80s when I was, in my late teens and early 20s, about 10 years before we all became conscious of CGI. And it's with the development of CGI that many of these technical terms have come back into use or have been widely used. So I suspect the term Terminator came in part from CGI, and then a certain kind of return to traditional representation in art also used them. But they're terms that are relatively new to me, those specific technical terms. Okay, so anyway, so now we're going to be talking about applying those elements of light and shadow to something we're going to be drawing. So a drawing that you'll all be working on tomorrow. Okay, so I'm going to escape here. Okay, so you can all see the setup now?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, so I have my cone and my egg illuminated in the way I would like people to illuminate your own cone and your own egg, or whatever version of, if some people had a paper cup, that's fine, in place of the cone. And so we're going to be doing a drawing of these objects so that we study how light and shadow falls on a form. Now, the cone is, the cone's a little bit, this is not ideal. The light and shadow's a little bit washed out, but I guess you can see it. So we have, let me actually, terribly disorganized today. Before I go on, let me just show that video, because I think that video is very helpful in just, again, reinforcing some of these basic elements of light and shadow. And I will post this video on Blackboard.
Filmmaker starts as a fan. I've been directing films for almost 4 decades, and I've picked up a few things along the way.
So by the way, this is a guy who does, you know, like innumerable people nowadays. They do, they sell how-to videos for art, for people who want to learn representational drawing and painting. And then they also do these previews on YouTube. So this is one of them. It's a little bit goofy, a little bit annoyingly goofy. Nevertheless, it makes clear the basics of light and shadow.
Hey, welcome to Proko. My name is Stan Prokopenko. A lot of you have been asking for a video on shading. The first thing you need to understand when starting to shade is how light affects the appearance of form, and how to properly capture the three-dimensional form based on the characteristics of the light in the scene. In some of my previous videos, I talked about things like shapes, values, and edges. But how do we know what shapes, values, and edges to draw? What exactly are we looking for? Well, we're looking at light and how it illuminates the objects in our picture. Light is the reason we see anything, and the characteristics of the light can completely change the appearance of the objects it illuminates. So I like to analyze the light in the scene and try to capture it so the viewer can feel the light. Form looking three-dimensional is just a byproduct of correctly capturing the light on the form. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that studying light on form is important. Now let's take a look at all the elements. For this, I'm going to need an egg. For this, I'm going to need an egg. There are two main zones, light and shadow. The edge where the form transitions from light to shadow is the terminator. It's located at the tangent between the light source and the form. In other words, just before the planes start to face away from the light. Let's start by talking about the shadow side. There are two types of shadows. Form shadow is a shadow caused by the planes turning away from the light source. Cast shadow is caused by one form blocking the light from hitting another form. This egg is blocking the light from reaching this part of the table. You can find this shape by projecting lines from the light source to the terminator of the first form, and continuing those lines to the obstructed form. Shadows will rarely be completely black. Light bounces off objects in the environment and is reflected back into the shadows. This is called reflected light. In this case, the light will bounce off the paper and into the shadow on the egg. Along the terminator, sometimes you will see a core shadow. It's a darker plane that defines the edge of the shadow. The thickness and softness of the core shadow can vary quite a bit. It depends on the thickness of the form, how sharp the edge is between the planes of light and dark, or the angle and position of the reflecting light source. Sometimes you won't see the core shadow at all, only if there is something on the shadow side to reflect back enough light to create a visible difference in value. This dark piece of paper reflects less light than the white paper. You can see a drastic difference in the value of the reflected light. Also, regarding the visibility of a core shadow, the reflection has to come from the right angle. If it's directly behind the shadow side, it will create a nice core shadow. If we move the reflection source closer to the angle of the main light source, it will illuminate the area where the core shadow would have been. If you don't see a distinct core shadow, many artists choose to cheat one in.
Okay, I want to stop there because he just said something really important. If you don't see a distinct core shadow, many artists choose to cheat one in. The reason an artist will do that, and that's often true, and I referred to that in the Pierre-Paul Prud'homme figure drawing, where Prud'homme emphasizes the reflected light in the core of the shadow. That's because when we can see the core of the shadow and reflected light, it helps enhance the sense of roundness. Because if we don't have a reflected light in a core of the shadow, this area just becomes empty and flat. But when we have the reflected light in the core of the shadow, we have more of a sense of that volume rolling around. So that's a really important point, that if you don't see a distinct core shadow, many artists choose to cheat one in. It's also important because when we're rendering light and shadow to create a sense of volume, we don't want to just not blindly, but mechanically copy what we're looking at. We want to interpret and emphasize those things that are most important in the creation of the volume. So what he just said there is very important.
Because it can add to the three-dimensionality of the form. Reflected light doesn't just affect form shadows, it also affects cast shadows. Less light can bounce into this deep crevice where the egg and table meet, and so that area gets darker as it goes deeper. This is called an occlusion shadow. Moving on to the light zone. Immediately after the terminator is the halftone. These are planes of the form that are partially hit by the direct light. As the planes get closer and closer to facing the light, they will get lighter. And the point where the form points directly at the light is called the center light. Don't confuse the center light with the highlight. The difference between the two is that the center light is the plane facing the light source, whereas the highlight is a reflection of the light source. A reflection will move depending on where the viewer is. So let's say this is the egg. The viewer or the camera is down here, and the light source is over here. The center light will be here facing the light source. The highlight, however, will need to be at the point where the light can bounce off the surface of the egg and reach the viewer's eyes. These two angles need to be equal. If you've played billiards, this is very similar. To test this concept, let's mark the point of the highlight. And mark another point for the center light. Now let's move the camera and see what happens. Okay, you can see here that the highlight moved to a different spot, following the camera. The center of light hasn't changed. It's still pointing directly at the light source. Don't let the math of all this confuse you. Highlights and cast shadows that we discussed earlier can be changed, and they'll still look believable. Nobody's going to call you on a highlight being in the wrong spot. I can take the highlight on this egg, move it to a different spot, and change the shape, and it still looks believable. I will often change the shape of a cast shadow to better describe the form it's being cast onto. For example, if I have an object that casts a shadow appearing to go against the form of this paper towel roll is a cylinder. And to show that, I would change the cast shadow from the egg to wrap around the cylinder. I usually try to describe the form that the shadow is casting onto rather than the form casting the shadow. So give yourself artistic license. Learn the rules, and then learn how you can break the rules to improve your drawing. Just want to let you guys know I'll be releasing a DVD very soon, so keep your eyes out. It's going to have all the video tutorials I've done so far, plus a few extras that'll be available only on the DVD. I'm hoping to have it available in the next few weeks. And as always, if you like this video, share with your friends. They might like it too. And don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter on Proko.com to get the latest.
So just to follow up on that, these are actually, a lot of these videos are helpful. I mean, I don't, often these artists will be very conservative and, will, for example, not talk about modern art or that kind of thing. Nevertheless, for the basics of, and I don't advocate that kind of conservatism.
Every filmmaker starts as a fan.
Like rejecting modern art. But if you're just interested in some of the basics of light and shadow or various different drawing techniques, a lot of these are actually very good. So it's always worth looking at some of these. All of these that are appearing on this right-hand bar are good. I've watched them. This is good. This is good. This is a good video here. So I can recommend those for sure. Okay. Okay, so back to what we're going to be doing today. All right, so while that video was rolling, I blocked in the cone so that you aren't all tortured as I block in the cone. Let me just move this camera to get an ideal. I think that's okay. Let's see. Okay, so again, my view of the setup is going to be a little bit different from yours, so bear that in mind. Okay, so I've blocked in the cone, and so now I just want to mention something about blocking in the egg. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do in blocking in the egg, just going back to the kind of relational drawing we've been looking at, is I'm going to ask myself, where does the egg intersect the line of the cone? So for me, as I'm looking carefully at that, the egg intersects the line of the cone about here. So I know that's where I'm going to place the left-hand edge of the egg. And then how much below the cone, what's the angle from the bottom of the cone to the bottom of the egg? It's something like that. So this is just going back to our relational drawing. And then I'm going to ask myself, how much space compared to the width of the cone is there between the right-hand edge of the egg and the cone? So I'm looking at that negative shape that's created. So in other words, there's a negative shape that's created between the edge of the egg and the cone. And I'm asking myself, what does that negative shape look like? It's a little bit wider. And so this, I spoke to several people on Thursday about avoiding drawing these objects like the cone with a ruler. So you want to, just to emphasize that again, you want to get into the habit of trying to be able to make lines that are both structural, that appear to be structural just by hand. So start practicing the ability to make kind of long sweeping lines that you can always clean them up if you want them to be precise lines. Develop the ability to do that so that your drawings can appear both structural but also lively at the same time. Okay, so roughing in, so I'm just roughing in the placement of the egg. Then I'm going to take the same approach to drawing the egg that I used to draw the pepper last week. I'm going to block it in. I'm not just going to try to trace around that. I'm not going to just try to trace around the shape. I'm going to block in with a series of tight arcs. I have a little bit of wax on the bottom of my egg that's holding it on the surface. I'm not going to draw that little bit of wax. So I've blocked in my cone and my egg. And I'm paying careful attention to the proportion, the size of the egg compared to the cone. So this is just our block in sage. So very similar to the way, again, very similar to the way we blocked in the pepper. And I'll clean up my line. So I have my simple block in of those two simple forms. And now, so I have a situation very similar. I have a light and dark, a light situation very similar to the light and shadow situation in several of the drawings we looked at. I have the light coming from the upper left. And so these objects have their light mass. This light mass here on the egg. They have their shadow mass here, shadow mass here. And then each has a core of the shadow, reflected light, halftone, cast shadow, highlight, occlusion shadows, that's the name I forgot, or the shadow accent. So we're gonna look for those elements, and we're gonna use those elements to successfully render the light and shadow on these objects and create and enhance our sense of volume. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to block in, I'm gonna use light and I'm going to use a line to block in the point on these objects where they shift from shadow, from light to shadow. So what I'm doing is I'm blocking, or blocking in that line we call the terminator or the shadow edge. So I'm locating where the form turns from light into shadow. Now the light and shadow on the cone is very simple. It's a straight line, right? So as you're looking at the cone, don't be confused by the camera distortions of the cone that's creating a sense of a curve here. Okay, you're gonna note that on the cone, the line will be pretty much straight. So it's going to be a little bit more of a complicated shape of shadow. And I'm going to block on the egg, and I'm going to block in the shape of the shadow on the egg in the same way I blocked in the contour of the egg. I'm not going to just draw a generic, non-descriptive kind of curve. I'm going to look at the way that shadow edge moves around those structural planes on the egg. An egg is actually not completely, it's not a completely smooth curved surface. There are slight structural planar shifts on an egg. So shadow comes up to the top, shadow edge comes up to the top. Switch around. So find the specific character of that shadow edge on these objects you're drawing. Now I'm going to look for the cast shadow, and I use the black surface to put the egg on because I wanted to minimize the reflected light. I didn't want to eliminate, sometimes if you have a light surface, so much light reflects into the shadow that you stop being able to see the shadow. So I wanted to minimize that. But because I'm using a black surface, we can't see with great clarity the cast shadow. But if you look here, you'll see that there's a cast shadow that runs right here. And then we get that kind of that round ellipse-like shape of the cast shadow. There's a little bit of light sneaking between the cone and the egg, and then we get another cast shadow here. So I'm going to draw that cast shadow in. And there's the cast shadow. Back here, and it becomes a little bit distorted, but. So, okay, so I have my contours blocked in and I have my shadow shapes blocked in, right? Or I have the light mass, shadow mass, cast shadow. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do in rendering these volumes is just block in an average shadow mass in the entire shadow shapes. So I'm not in any way going to look for any subtlety. I'm just going to block in a completely unified shadow shape. So I'm blocking in over the lines I've drawn, demarcating the shadow shapes. But I will go back in and erase those away. I'll show you what I mean in a second. So I'm just, the first stage in this is just blocking in a completely unified, unmodulated shadow shape. So I want to very strongly emphasize this. I am completely ignoring, deliberately ignoring any of the subtlety that I can see within the lights or within the shadows. And I'm doing that because I want to first establish, on the one hand, those large masses of light and dark. And I want to get a very clear sense of the unity of the light situation. So I want to get a very clear sense of a convincing, raking light over these objects. So again, I've started by just blocking in a unified middle value up to the, within the shadow shapes I've traced out. And now I'm just cleaning up the edges of those shadow shapes, bringing the tone back. Up to the terminator. So I like to block in the light and shadow without trying to stop my pencil at the shadow edge, because I think it helps me get a cleaner set of lines, and it helps avoid a kind of overlapping of the pencil when I bring the stroke back and forth. So the first step is just to block in those big unified masses of light and shadow. So again, a very important aspect of the light and shadow on this drawing right now, I'm deliberately ignoring reflected light. So I want to have reflected light. I want to have a core of the shadow, but I do not want to overstate. I don't want to overstate the reflected light. I don't want to make reflected light too strong of an element. So again, you want to start the rendering of the volumes by just blocking in a completely unified, unmodulated light mass and a completely unified, unmodulated shadow mass. So another thing I want to emphasize, and I'm going to insist on this, in studying light and shadow as we're doing it, is nobody should render light and shadow by smudging. So you don't want to go in and smudge these pencil marks. Smudging is a commonly used method of creating tone, but it's a method of creating tone that creates more, just put it this way, it's a kind of amateur way of creating tone that doesn't allow you to use as many techniques as possible to create a sense of volume. So all of the tone you block in, you're going to be blocking in but with pencil marks. You're not going to be doing, and all of the gradations of tone are going to be done just with pencil marks, no smudging at all. So I really want to emphasize that, and I want to really get people to practice ways of making tone without smudging. So if you smudge the drawing, I'm going to deduct a full letter grade. So I hate to be insistent about that, but smudging diminishes the sense of volume instead of enhances it. Because when you smudge something, you're just rubbing on the surface instead of trying to get the object to roll around in space. So if you're interested in a completely unified tone, then you want to, on the one hand, practice blocking in tone so that you have very clean, consistent strokes. And then you can go back in if you want to make this tone completely knit together. You can go back in and continue to fill in that tone. So in other words, if I wanted to make this tone completely unified, I could go in and start darkening areas in the shadow mass that are lighter. So admittedly, it's a little bit of a laborious technique. But again, smudging is not a technique we're going to be using. And you're not allowed to use it. Again, I hate to be so insistent on that, but it's not a technique that's helpful in creating a sense of volume. All it does is create a kind of greasy transition between tones. So on this egg, I'm just refining the shadow shapes. And now I'm just further unifying this tone of the shadow. So that I'm starting with a completely unified form of the shadow and cast shadow.
Professor,
Yes.
you're doing the cast shadow of the egg, but not of the cone.
Yeah, I'm just doing that to, I'm doing that for two reasons, to be honest with you, or two reasons. The first is because I don't want to, I'm gonna, in the course of our time today, I'm not gonna have a lot of time to render this whole thing. So I'm at this stage ignoring that cast shadow. Just because I don't want to take up too much time, I'm gonna concentrate mostly on the egg, just because of time. I also don't, aesthetically, I don't really like this cast shadow. So let's see, let's put that in. So if this were my drawing, it is my drawing, but if I were doing this drawing as a kind of finished piece, I'm not sure I like that cast shadow. I just think compositionally it doesn't work so well. But since you asked, let's put it in. We can decide. I just don't want to spend a lot of time on that and not have enough time to show you how to start developing the full rendering of the volume on all the objects. But thanks for pointing that out, because I think probably that would have been confusing to a lot of people.
Professor,
Yes.
for our actual summit, you're going to want us to do a cast shadow, right?
Yes, I want you to look at the
Everything.
topics. I want you to find the light mass, the shadow mass, and the cast shadows on these objects. That's right.
Okay. Cool.
So on the camera, people can see very clearly how there are, at this point, darker areas because of pencil overlaps, darker area here. So if that kind of thing bugs you, you can take your pencil eraser, your kneaded rubber eraser, and go in and pick those out. If you want to create a completely unified tone, that is a technique you can use, and it's I personally do that in my drawings. Certainly, there are artists who are not that interested in a clean, unified tone, which is fine. That's a stylistic preference. But if you are interested in that, then you can go in with the eraser and pick those out. Some people find that sort of hideously laborious. I actually don't mind doing it. I find it kind of relaxing, but I also want the kind of look you get from doing that. Okay, so we're starting to have our light masses and dark masses blocked in. I will block in that sort of irregular cast shadow on the wall. Of course, there are certain techniques of drawing where you can put down a tone much faster, like certain forms of charcoal. Here we're going to be very carefully studying the elements of light and shadow, and I think it's not a bad idea to do it with pencil first. So a lot of drawing classes, and people may have experienced this, instead of using pencils, they often use vine charcoal, in part because you're able to put down tones much more quickly. Sometimes I do drawings. I have my classic drawings with vine charcoal. The only issue with vine charcoal is I feel like it's by nature a broad medium. So it doesn't really allow for a very careful study of the elements of light and shadow. You can do it with vine charcoal for sure. But I think some ways working with pencil is just a better way to do it. Okay, so are there any questions so far? Or are there any questions about why I would create such a stark simplification of the light and shadow? I'll sort of answer my own question. One thing I want to make sure I do is I want to make sure that I'm never confusing. So I want to make sure that my lights and my darks are unified. In other words, I never want any light that's in the shadow, any reflected light, to be anywhere near as light as anything in the light source. And I never want any dark or halftone that's in the light side to be nearly as dark as anything in the shadow. So I'm blocking in with this kind of simplicity so that I set up right away that clarity of light and dark. So now I would continue to unify these areas of lights and darks a little bit more. But I'm going to leave it right now so that we can move on to finding some of those elements of light and shadow. I don't want to torture you all by laboriously unifying these light and shadow shapes. But you want to block them in so that you have a kind of, a tonal unity, right? So that you have a unified middle tone. So now I mentioned earlier that we're going to render these forms by looking for those elements of light and shadow that we talked about. So let's go over those again on this egg that I'm going to concentrate on rendering. So we have the light mass. We have that crescent shape of the shadow mass. We have the terminator that I've drawn here. Now I'm going to be looking for exactly how reflected light appears within the shadow mass. I'm going to be looking for the shape of the core of the shadow. I'm going to be asking myself how softly the shadow transitions into the light, how soft or how hard the halftone should be in that transition. And I'm not going to have a lot of room with pencil to really indicate a highlight. I may try to do that slightly. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to look for is the core of the shadow and the reflected light. And I'm going to find reflected light not by, I'm not going to create reflected light by erasing what I already have in the shadow. I'm going to find reflected light only by darkening what's already in the shadow. Now, you may be wondering, or you may be saying to yourself that this reflected light, though, is very light. It's much lighter than anything there. But I'm going to get rid of the black behind it. I want you to show you how dark that reflected light is. If I remove the black, which is much darker than the shadow, notice how dark that shadow is and how much darker the shadow is than anything in the light source. So I want to make sure that my shadow is never as, nothing in the shadow is as light as anything in the light. So I'm going to go in and I'm just going to start darkening around the reflected light to create that reflected light. So the first thing I'm going to put in is the occlusion shadow on the cast shadow. So the occlusion shadow is that darker area of shadow.
Excuse me, Professor?
Yeah.
What kind of pencil do you want us to use for
I'm sorry?
What kind of pencil do you want us to use? Like HB, 2B, 4B?
Well, any of them will work. You should experiment with them and decide which ones you prefer. Remember that the 2B and the 4B will be darker. It'll be easier to make a dark mark. But some people do like to use a lighter pencil and just bear down. It's really something you all should experiment with and decide what you like best. Right now I'm using a B, so it's just one step darker than an HB.
Right.
So the first thing I'm doing is putting in the occlusion shadow or the shadow accent. Now I'm going to, it's not exactly finished, but now I'm going to look at the core of the shadow. How wide is the core of the shadow? And what's the specific character? What's the shape and the character of the core of the shadow? So is it wider at certain points? Is it narrower at others? Does it transition into the reflected light in a relatively soft way? Is there an abrupt transition at certain points? So I'm carefully looking at that as I develop the core of the shadow. And so notice how, as I'm developing this core of the shadow, the reflected light just appears, right? I don't need to remove any tone to create that core of the shadow. And the core of the shadow continues underneath, gets narrower as it becomes part of that narrow shadow shape at the bottom of the bottom of the egg. So as I'm doing these marks, I'm using little circular marks. And remember, I want to emphasize again, you're not going to be making these by smudging. There are certain materials that are better suited to smudging, like charcoal. You can use a stump to smudge charcoal, but it's not well suited to graphite because when you smudge graphite, it ends up looking like a greasy stain. So I'm switching now to an HB. It's a little bit harder. I can control that a little bit more. So now now I've started to block in that core of the shadow. And I'm looking now for exactly how it softens into the reflected light. So here I'm using my eraser just to pick out any little pencil overlaps that I don't think create a nice sense of the transition of those tones, or little marks that interfere with the sense of the subtle transition of those values. So the reflected light gets a little bit softer and less apparent at the top of the egg as it approaches the top of the egg. So again, I'm concentrating on rendering the light and shadow on this egg by looking for those elements of light and shadow. Light mass, dark mass, core of the shadow, reflected light. Shadow accent or occlusion shadow. And in a minute, I'm going to look for the halftone. So right now, I just have the main light mass and the main dark mass. And I'm starting to render in reflected light and core shadow. And I have that started in a way that I think is starting to look like a reasonable approximation of the light and shadow on the egg. I can go in and start to do some housekeeping. Although again, I won't torture you doing too much of that because that very, very fine gradation of tone is not a requirement at all. That's a stylistic choice. But I do certainly want to see these elements of light and shadow in the drawing. Okay, so now we talked earlier about the division of light and shadow and the fact that the light transitions into the shadow in a soft and gradual way. And that's achieved by finding and drawing the halftones that we see. So I'm now going to look, I'm going to start to make, I'm going to try to create the softness of that transition in my drawing. Right now, my drawing has a kind of hard transition. So I am now going to ask myself, how does the shadow transition into the light? How wide is the halftone? And exactly how soft is that transition? So I'm going to go to the edge of my shadow, and I'm just going to start softening that edge. And softening that edge out. I'm creating the halftone by first softening the edge of my shadow. And then I'm going to extend that softening out to the left until it creates the kind of halftone I'm looking at. And the halftone is a plane. So it's not just kind of a flat, like Photoshop gradation on a surface. These halftones are the areas of halftone are specific planes that are receiving some light but not full light, right? So these are planes on the form that are at oblique angles to the light source. as opposed to this area here, which we refer to as the center light, which is at the planes of the center light of the form are at perpendicular angles. They're perpendicular to the light source. They're at right angles to the light source. So I'm softening the edge of the softening that edge. So I started with the shadow mass, both of the form shadow and the cast shadow. And then I blocked in the core of the shadow and the core of the shadow and the occlusion shadow or the shadow accent to bring out the reflected light. And now I'm using a halftone to make a soft transition from the shadow into the light mass. So that's not just a stark, abrupt transition. Now, one thing I want to make clear is I want to always retain the clarity of our sense of the dark mass and the light mass. So the light mass has a specific shape, the dark mass has a specific shape, and I don't want to lose that by overemphasizing the gradations of the halftone. So you want a halftone to soften the edge, but you don't want to lose the clarity of the lights and darks. So always bear that in mind. Now, before I go any further on the egg, let me just clarify a few things by adding some tone. So I'm going to clarify the division between the cast shadow and the cone by indicating the dark of the cast shadow behind. So separating the cone from the cast shadow. In a sense, this is an occlusion shadow back there. And the shadow, the cast shadow from the cone behind the egg is quite dark. It's darker than, I believe it's darker than the form shadow on the egg. So I'm going to start to indicate that. Now, people who haven't done a lot of drawing before, or this kind of drawing before, you may find it difficult to control the pencil in this kind of rendering. It may get frustrating. You know, there's no magic bullet to that. That's just about practice. So try not to get too frustrated. Just try to approach this as practicing this kind of rendering, doing your best. And again, it's not going to happen immediately. This is the type of technique and skill that you have to practice. So this class is an opportunity to do that.
So Professor, can I just ask you a question? The egg, is it the form shadow or the cast shadow of the egg on the cast shadow of the cone? I'm a little confused.
You mean what I'm drawing right now?
Yeah, with this.
I'm just blocking in this dark mass here. Because this dark, that's the cast shadow of the cone. And that's darker than the shadow on the cone or anything on the egg. So I'm just starting to block that in order to start to bring in some of the darks in the setup. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
But the dark that I'm putting in right now is just the dark of the cast shadow of the cone. And I'm going to leave it a little bit rough because I don't want to take too much time on just endless refining of this. I just want to start to indicate the dark. And so it's useful for us in our rendering of the egg because we can see a very dark value behind the egg here at the upper right-hand corner of the egg. And that helps to reveal the reflected light on the egg, but allows us to reveal the reflected light on the egg without making that reflected light too light. Does that make sense? So we can keep the reflected light dark, but it still reads as light compared to the very, very darkest parts of the drawing. Okay, so what I want to do here, I'd like to take our break, and then we'll come back and spend a little bit more time, further rendering this before we end for today. Okay, so we'll take our mid-class break. We're beyond the middle of the class, and we'll start up again at 11:52. Okay. So now, in a sense, the drawing is, now that we've identified those elements of light and shadow and started to bring them in, the drawing would be about refining some of those elements. So I think that halftone is starting to work pretty well, turning that shadow edge into the light. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Professor, I have a question. Wouldn't the cast shadow of the egg be darker?
Yeah, the cast shadow of the egg is certainly darker. So this, as I continue to develop, I'm going to continue to develop all of those elements. You mean the cast shadow here, right, that I'm drawing right now?
Yes.
Yeah. So this, at this point, it's about refining all of those observations we made. But yes, certainly this would be darker.
I also have a question, Professor. How do you define the what is it? The Terminator so clearly. Like, what do you do again? Did you erase points where you shaded in the egg on the right-hand side, or did you just lightly go over with the pencil lighter than the other portion of the egg?
I'm not totally sure what you mean. How did I soften that transition?
Or how did you define the Terminator so clearly and then transition it into a lighter shadow behind it? Because it looks like the Terminator is the darkest part of it. I just wanted to know how you were able to get that.
Do you mean, so when you say the Terminator, do you mean this core of the shadow?
Yes, right there.
How do I transition that into the tones around it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so what I'm doing is I'm putting in a darker tone.
When did you last speak to her? Me too.
And then really just using the pencil point, I'm just softening the edge by adding, by being lighter and lighter with my pencil. And I'm using like tiny little round strokes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I wanted to know the technique.
Yeah, so I'm just softening that edge. Again, just, touching the surface of the paper where I need to make make that kind of soft transition from the core of the shadow into the reflected light. Like I used to have a teacher who called that tickling the paper. I'm just very lightly adding a little bit of tone that just softens the edge. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
So I'll actually pick up on that question. So another place, like you'll notice that I have a very clearly delineated cast shadow, right? Where when we look at the cast shadow on the surface of the table, it's very soft. So I started with a clearly delineated cast shadow, but I do want to soften that edge. So what I'm doing is I'm just taking my pencil and I'm working the edge of that cast shadow. Just making that edge sort of a little bit smoky, a little bit softer. Just rolling the pencil over it, giving that edge just a little bit of softness. Sometimes I think about it like as similar to like taking a shot, like an edge of a table and sanding it down. But let me see if I can actually get the camera a little bit closer so that people can see. I'm not sure it's going to pick up the image, but let's see. Let's see if I can get the camera closer here so you can see a little bit more clearly what I'm doing. Yeah, I think that works. It's clear enough. So I'm just here, just at this edge. Just turning that edge like this. And then I'll go in with my eraser and pick out some of those slightly darker areas. And I'm looking at the edge in the object I'm drawing. Now, I'm not going to color in or block in the dark of the black tabletop. Just because all I want to concentrate on today are those basic elements of light and shadow on the form itself, and on the form itself and on the cast shadow. So we don't need to see all of the values in the entire setup. So for today, you don't need to block in, like the value for the gray of the background, that kind of thing. So we're just concentrating on those elements of light and shadow on the object itself. So as I continue to refine the rendering of the egg, I'm gonna, in order to knit this tone together, so you'll see here, there's a little dot of lighter, a little dot of lighter there, and this is a little bit scraggly in here. So I want to try to clean that up. Now that's a personal preference. I'm just showing this technique. So I'm going in and sort of spot rendering, just to start to knit that together. You don't have to do this kind of absolutely smooth rendering, but sometimes people ask about how to achieve it. So this is a technique, and it's a technique that in the end, you end up with a much more convincing transition of tone than if you just go in and smudge. This is it's more painstaking, but I think in the end, you have a much more convincing depiction of the way value turns on a form.
Yeah, I just wanted to make it look as believable as possible. So
Make it look as what?
believable as possible. So you're saying light pencil strokes around the edge in little tiny circles, but not pressing too hard?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And to make this as seamlessly smooth as some of the drawings we looked at earlier, like that Proudhon figure drawing or that very finely rendered sphere, you just have to keep working the surface. Which I'm not going to do here just because it would, end up eating up all our time. But this is the basic technique of achieving that. So, here on the shadow, on the edge of the core of the shadow, I'm going to continue to soften that. And eventually give it the sense of where you can't quite tell where the edge ends and just the tabletop begins. Soften this. Again, just, just giving a smoky, sort of tickling in a kind of smoky, soft edge to that shape. And also paying attention to how it happens on the object. So I'm not just doing some kind of imaginary invention here. Because part of my objective, at least in this drawing, is to make it appear, make my drawing a convincing depiction of what I'm looking at, particularly the sense of volume. Let me pull back again. Sorry about that. Now, I want to briefly touch on the other elements in the still life. So what happens? So now how do I start handling the cone? So the first thing, again, I'm going to do is look for those elements of light and shadow. So I see very clearly a core of the shadow here. It runs from the top of the shadow mass to the bottom. So I'm going to block in that core of the shadow, and that core of the shadow, or because of the particular form of this cone, I think up and down strokes work well to block that in. And so like I did in the egg, I'll work that. I'm going to look at the value of that. And I'm going to compare that value to the value of the egg. So roughing in that core of the shadow. So overall, to me, this shadow mass should get darker. So I'm going to go in with some more passes. And deepen that shadow. Go in again and darken the core of the shadow. I'm going to pick out some of those pencil overlaps that create a choppy tone. So I'll start working that edge. I'm going to work the core of the shadow so that that starts to transition softly into the reflected light. And I will start to bring in that very soft half tone along the shadow edge. And doing the same thing, just sort of nudging with a kind of smoky tone, smoky gradient, just nudging that edge so that it starts to turn. Go in here with, keep working that edge. And I'm being a bit broader and a little bit rougher than when I was doing the egg, just so I can start getting some of these big areas masked in. Try to always observe the core of the shadow and reflected light along the entirety of the shadow mass. Sometimes it's a little bit more prominent, sometimes a little bit less prominent, depending on the reflective surfaces. But in general, you're going to be able to find that core of the shadow along the totality of the form shadow. And this is that's a soft edge, right? So I started that with a very abrupt edge, but that, because of the light sneaking in here, that's a very soft edge. That's not, sometimes depending on the light source, you'll get a very crisp cast shadow, like our shadows on the sidewalk on a bright sunny day. But depending on the peculiarities of the light source, you may get a very soft cast shadow. And this cast shadow is relatively soft. Now, right now, I'm not being particularly conscious of an absolutely integrated and smooth surface. I'm just trying to get in some of those basic principles. Finding all those basic elements of light and shadow on the different surfaces. Bringing those in. This edge too is soft. Soften that edge. So at this stage, still, I still consider all this to be a kind of roughing in, looking back and forth, comparing. And I would continue to refine all this. And at this stage of the drawing, now that I have the big light and dark masses blocked in, and I have most of the main elements in, even if they're not as subtle as I want them to be eventually, I would start moving around the drawing, starting to bring things up to the same level of finish. So I mentioned the highlight a few minutes ago, the highlight on the egg and the highlight on the cone. So with this technique, a technique where you're blocking in with graphite, getting to the highlight is a very laborious process. So getting to the highlight would be about bringing in, and the highlight is barely discernible. The highlight of this egg is not really discernible, so I actually would not bother. The highlight is around here. And getting up to the highlight would be about bringing an incredibly subtle tone up to that and leaving the highlight white. But in this drawing, given the medium we're using, I don't think it's necessary. I think just establishing the main lights and shadows and then transitioning out to the halftones is going to be plenty to create the form.
Professor, what about the halftones on the cone?
Yeah, I mean, I would keep developing that. So there's a rather broad halftone on the cone. So I would just continue to transition these halftones out. And so now there's a big difference between the way I'm perceiving the cone and the way it's recorded on the camera. So the halftones on the cone go to about here. Because of the way the camera is blowing out or bleaching out the tonal subtlety on the cone as it's closest to the light source, it appears that the halftone goes all the way over to here. But that's actually the highlight. And the halftones are not quite that broad. So that's just a problem of looking at this on the camera. But certainly I would continue that softening of the shadow edge out to the completeness of the halftone. Does that make sense, what I just described? Steffi, does that make sense?
Yes.
So yes, I would just keep working that halftone. So 12, 20, yeah. So I mean, so what I would do, again, is just keep slowly transitioning this gradation out to the halftone. Now, this is, as everyone is probably observing here, this is a rather painstaking technique. And unless you smudge with graphite, which again, I do not want people to do. So I want people to develop a technique, something like this, either a more broadly stated technique or a very smoothly rendered technique. That's up to you. There certainly are techniques of getting a full range of value that are faster and less laborious. And we'll actually be exploring one of those techniques. This is just a way of really studying. I think that this really encourages really studying and looking at all of those tones that help to make up a fully rendered and believable volume. So artists who make work in this kind of laborious technique, there's always there's almost always an element in their work where they want to emphasize both labor and time. So part of the meaning of the work, almost always, has to do with labor and time. And so in a sense, with this kind of drawing, you really, in a way, experience the time that was involved in making it. And that becomes part of the meaning. So what I just used there, this is, by the way, called a maul stick. And you'll see artists using this. It's if you want to put up a barrier between your work and the page so that you can do sort of fine work without smudging the drawing. Some people like to use a maul stick. I use it all the time. All this is a dowel I bought at the hardware store. And then I put this little rubber end on it. They do sell maul sticks in art supply stores. It costs about 25 bucks. The advantage to a maul stick that you buy in an art supply store is you can take it apart and easily transport it. And the top of a maul stick that you buy in an art store is a soft pad with a piece of leather around it. So it's probably a little bit better if you're resting that on your drawing. But this can be a very useful tool. So while I'm developing the rendering here, I would rest my hand on the maul stick so that I don't go in with my hand and smudge the drawing. So here I'm slowly working out the halftone, being a bit rough, just so that I can explain the basic principles without worrying too much about an absolutely smooth transition. But so now we go from that simplification of the light and dark into a tonal transition that starts to seem to be wrapping around in space. Does anyone have any questions at this point? So I'm going to, I don't know that there's any point in me continuing to just develop this as you all are watching. The process of bringing this to completion now is just continuing to observe the subtleties adding value where necessary. So I would make this cast shadow continue to make it darker. And I would continue to knit it together so that it's one continuous smooth tone. And again, that's the technique I was showing of going in. So I'm going to go in and let me bring this up here again. To start making these tones continuous, in other words, unbroken, I would go in with my pencil doing this. Taking out but you could certainly leave the rendering, like you could leave these kinds of marks. I don't want to give the wrong impression. You don't have to do a completely unified continuous tone. You can have a drawing where you have these kind of hatch marks in it. That's fine, as long as you're clearly developing light mass, dark mass, core of the shadow, reflected light, halftone, occlusion shadow, or shadow accent. All of those elements of light and shadow have to be there. It doesn't have to be an absolutely smoothly rendered drawing. Does that make sense to people?
Yep.
Now I'm going to end my demo here and just again say that I would certainly continue to develop this drawing, continue to refine and fill out the tones. Let me show you a couple things, just so. I'm going to switch my share. So, and before I end this, does anyone have any questions about this going forward?
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. You go ahead. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. I was just gonna ask: is this the assignment for tomorrow? Right? We just need a cone.
This is the assignment you should be working on tomorrow.
Okay, and then get the box right.
Yeah, get the box, your light, and then do this assignment tomorrow.
And when does that due?
Yeah, again, it can be due. Let's say the following Monday.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
And then we just have the sketchbook for the week, right? That's due Thursday?
For Thursday, yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sefi, what was your question?
I was just going to remind you if you could please send us the YouTube link.
Yes, you mean for that discussion?
Yeah. Yes.
I'll put that
Thank you.
on Blackboard. It'll be up on Blackboard by late afternoon or evening. Okay, I'll get all that stuff up. Okay. If you want, Sefi, if you want to search for it more quickly, just go to YouTube and type in Proko, Proko, and then light and shadow, and it'll come up. But I will post that on Blackboard.
Thank you.
Sure. So let me just say something about, because I've been talking about rendering very finely, and that is something that I do that personally in my work because I like that kind of rendering, and I also do like the element of time and not quite labor, but actually I think of like very careful rendering as creating a kind of like sealed off atmosphere in the drawing, which I like that. I like that kind of strangeness of the kind of sealed off world. That's just a kind of atmosphere and expression I like in my work. So that's a personal interest. But let me just talk a little bit about, let me pull up some images. So let's see. So let's start with, I'll show you one of the images. So of course we looked at this image, which when we look at it, it looks very highly polished, you know, with the exception of areas here where the artist has obviously left the marks. I'm not sure how high res this is. Okay, let's look in a little bit closer. So I was talking today about a very careful and smooth rendering, but notice this artist very clearly leaves the marks of the tool, right? Why is the artist leaving those marks there? What function does that serve?
Would it help differentiate like the different shadows?
It helps differentiate the shadows, but what else? Like notice how these aren't just straight marks, like notice what those marks are doing. What else are those marks helping to communicate?
Texture?
Well, it's, yes, in certain areas, like here, it helps communicate the texture of the hair, right?
Spontaneity?
Well, it does do that. It gives the work a certain kind of like liveliness and life. That's true. And, you know, sometimes a criticism is that the drawings that are rendered so that everything's totally smooth may be read as a kind of, you know, they have a kind of deadness to them. Not this drawing so much because this has, you know, it's such a seductive atmosphere. Anyone else? Like, what else is this? Are these marks doing? I'll find another drawing. Let's see.
It could be a stylistic choice.
It is a stylistic choice. You mean? Do you mean by that they just like the look of it?
Yeah, I guess because if you smudge everything, it starts looking all the same. For I don't know. When I draw, it's I leave the marks, and then it makes it easier to smudge certain areas because the graphite collects.
Well, what I think what you're referring to is that this gives a certain like, it might imbue the drawing with a certain, like the personality of the artist. Like one artist makes marks one way, one artist makes marks another way, or it gives it a kind of a way of making a drawing that distinguishes one artist from another. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
It also creates, there's that, and it also creates a kind of variety of marks in the drawing itself. So this is totally smooth, but then we experience marks. So, you know, there's a kind of tension and a balance between different ways of making the drawing, and people can often find pleasure in that. You know, just a kind of drawing pleasure in that. So let me look, let's see, who should I look for? I feel like I go to Michelangelo too much. Okay, let's take Francois Boucher. Boucher, who was a 18th century French artist. So why? So here's Boucher. It's very subtle rendering, right? But the light's coming from the upper left. So this very believable, like look how round that volume seems. That volume, as it turns away from the light, goes into the shadow, right? The shadows are subtle, but they're there nevertheless. Why is Boucher using marks that, notice the direction of the marks. Why is this highlight mark going this way and then these shadow marks going that way? What is that serving? Or what does that do in the drawing?
Does it, it's like a contour, gives it weight and like a form.
It gives it form. It reinforces the roundness of the volume. So the artist is using the direction of the mark to reinforce the roundness of the volume. And that's something that artists do over and over again. You'll see artists doing that. So, you know, let's just take, sorry to go to Michelangelo, but it's just easy. It immediately occurs to me. So, okay, let's look at this drawing. Michelangelo. Oops. It gets a little bit blurry. Okay, let me go to another one. That's not a very good example. Okay, well, so you see it here. So Michelangelo's starting the drawing, starting the rendering of the form by putting in marks that wrap around the volume, right? This is that kind of triangular shaped deltoid muscle, the muscle of your shoulder. As he's starting the rendering, he's wrapping those strokes around the volume. So he's reinforcing his perception of the roundness of these forms. So artists will do that. So Prud'hon is doing it going sort of down the form, right? So notice these marks cut under as the rib cage cuts underneath the external oblique muscle. And then where the external oblique muscle swells out, the strokes move in a different direction. Notice how those strokes wrap around the roundness of the gluteus maximus muscle, right? The muscle of that big, you know, like fleshy, meaty section of the bum, right? So that those strokes are wrapping around that to reinforce that sense of volume. So, you know, that's certainly something that you can experiment with, using marks of the, and marks of the drawing tool can serve all kinds of functions. So I just want to emphasize that. I showed the technique for rendering a smooth transition of tone, something like in this sphere drawing. But I certainly am not requiring that. And I only encourage that if that's a kind of technique you want to develop. So let's, again, have these drawings in my head, but so we've looked at Katie Kollwitz, just to reinforce this idea.
Doesn't Rembrandt do a lot with lines like that?
Rembrandt does that all the time, yes. Absolutely. Katie Kollwitz, let's look at her. So notice these strokes wrapping around the volume. So this is a pen drawing, right? So she's drawing with the little marks of a pen, and she's using those marks to wrap around the volume. So I don't know if I have any Rembrandt figure drawings, but let's see. I'm not sure. This is a beautiful Rembrandt drawing, but I'm actually not sure this one does that. Let's look. It does it to some extent. Yeah, we can't really see that. Let's move out. He's using large areas of wash to create tone. I mean, exactly the same kind of light and shadow we've been looking at. So he's not really doing it here. It's more in his straightforward pen drawings. I don't have any of his figure drawings. But anyway, I hope people get the picture. So, you know, that's certainly something you can incorporate into your drawing if you so desire. Nevertheless, I do want a clear sense of those major elements of light and shadow, okay? Does anybody have any questions about any of that? Or any questions going forward? Or in terms of what we want to be doing for tomorrow? Okay, so if there aren't any questions, we'll end for today. And just remember, Tomorrow you want to set up your still life. So you need a box, a light, and then you're going to set up your cone and your egg illuminated similar to the way I did it today, and try to do as much of a fully developed rendering, identifying those elements of light and shadow. So work on it. You should get as much of it done as you can in about a class session, so 3.5 hours. Certainly if you want to work on it for longer than that, obviously you're welcome to, but you really should, to get as much out of the assignment as possible, give at least 3.5 hours, a full class session to the drawing. And as always, I'm available tomorrow morning. If anyone needs me to look at their drawing at any point, you can text me and I will, you can text me and let me know that you're going to send me an image, or if you want to do that, or we can set up an individual Zoom session. Okay. So any questions about tomorrow?
Oh yeah, Professor?
Yes.
For the lamp, does it have to be the lamp that you have, or could it
No, it doesn't have to be the lamp I had. There are, all kinds of lamps could work. Like a desk lamp, could work. So let's
as long as it's adjustable, right? Like as long as like the light that's on the object.
Yeah, as long as you get a clear raking light source, right? That's all that matters.
Okay.
But like so, a lot of people have these kinds of desk lamps. Those work as long as you can position it. Whoops.
Professor, are we using the box for this?
Yes. So you want to put your still life in the box so that the box is blocking all light except for the light that comes from your lamp. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So this kind of light would work. So, many different kinds of lights will work. If anyone has one of those ring lights that have become popular with social media and TikTok and that kind of thing, that works. Why can't I find Amazon? Use it all the time. There we go. These kinds of desk lamps, these LED desk lamps work well. Anything like this. I don't think that an iPhone works very well. These types of things work well. So, any way you're able to set up a light situation, these types of things work pretty well, actually. So any kind of light that you can get to create that kind of clear raking light source. Like this kind of light works well. So this kind of light works very well, these ring lights. Okay. So any questions? Any other questions? Okay, so we'll end the session for today, and you can be in touch with me tomorrow. Otherwise, I'll see you on Thursday morning.
I actually have a couple of questions, Professor.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, the first one was, do you remember that point where you showed the back of a page up against the backside of the egg? I just wanted to know from the video we watched, wasn't it a darker piece of paper that showed less light of it rather than a lighter paper? Because it looked the exact opposite in that one, that demonstration.
In the video?
Yeah, I was just wondering why that was. Like the back of the egg got darker rather than lighter, since I thought the lighter page would reflect even more light to the back of the egg.
Well, let's go to the let's look at that video again.
shadow side to reflect back enough light.
So here he has the egg sitting on a black surface to minimize the reflection. And then he's bringing in a white surface to just illustrate reflected light. Is this the section that you mean?
Yeah.
So I actually wasn't quite doing this. I was putting this piece of paper back here in order to show how dark this shadow actually is.
Okay.
Because when we see this shadow against a black background, it looks relatively light. But if you put a piece of white paper behind the shadow, not so that it's reflecting, but just so that we see it back here, then you'll see that that's much darker than this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Okay.
That's all I was trying to illustrate. And let me actually, just so it's totally clear, I'll show you on, the camera. So let me go back to the camera. So what Proko was doing was using a piece of paper to show the varieties of reflected light. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
Now, do you notice how when we're looking at this egg and we can see this, when we can see this very dark cast shadow behind it, that reflected light looks very light. Does that make sense?
Yes.
But that reflected light is much darker than the light side of the form. And I just wanted to illustrate that by putting this back here. It's not reflecting. It's just it's using a white surface to set off the darkness of the shadow. Do you see what I mean?
Set off.
In other words, that white surface. So this gets at value being relative. In other words, right now the reflected light there looks dark, right?
Yeah.
But I'm going to take that white paper away, and now it looks light. But that reflected light hasn't changed at all. There's nothing over here that's reflecting any more light into that surface than there was before. But we're seeing this as very light because we're seeing it right next to a very dark value. And we see values as relative. That looks very light because it's next to a very dark value. When I put a very light value behind it, that now looks much darker because it's next to a very light value. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Okay.
But you can still see it, right? It's just much more subtle.
Yeah.
And that's my point. You never want to overemphasize the value of the reflected light, no matter how light it looks, because it's always definitely darker than the light side of the form.
Okay.
So you want to make sure that reflected light is darker than anything in the light side of the form.
Okay.
Okay. That was a really good, important question. And does anyone have any follow-ups about that? Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, we'll end for today. And I'll see you all on Thursday.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye, everybody.
Day.